Welcome to Scriptorium. This past week, we have celebrated two great feasts in our church. First, on the seventh Sunday of Easter, we celebrated the memory of the Holy Fathers of the First Ecumenical Council. And then we also celebrated the memory of Saints Constantine and Helen, first Christian emperors. And this time we are going to talk about the significance that both Constantine and the Holy Fathers of the First Ecumenical Council had for the history of our church and the history of Christianity in general. The First Ecumenical Council, which met in Nicaea in Bithynia in the year 325 AD, was an extraordinary phenomenon in the history of the Church. It was the result of developments in the life of the Church, and it was necessitated by the ever-flourishing theological thinking. By the 4th century, Christianity began a systematic examination of the Church's doctrines, such as the understanding of the nature of God. And the focal point of this examination was the teaching of Jesus as the source of the Christian understanding of God. Naturally, the teaching of Jesus was recorded in the Gospels, and there we find that Jesus speaks of God as Father, and he also speaks of his relationship to God the Father as that of a Son. And in the Gospel of John, we find that God is dwelling in his believers through the power of the Holy Spirit. Thus we find the Holy Trinity. In the 14th chapter of St. John's Gospel, we read that the Father and the Son would send the Holy Spirit, who would teach believers everything they need to know for their life of faith and service. And Christians speak of a threefold relationship to God, that is, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But the question was, who is this Father, Son, Holy Spirit God? Is God one or three gods? Many asked in the 4th century. Another question that occupied those early Christians was also, is Christ truly God or a lesser being, a demigod? And if Christ is truly God, then how is the salvation of the human race accomplished? The answer to these and many other questions which plague the 4th century Christian Church was made possible through the First Ecumenical Council, which was convoked by the grace of God and through the ministry of the first Christian emperor, Constantine the Great. Constantine rose to power at a very challenging period for the Church. Persecutions of Christians continued periodically from the beginning of the Church, so to speak, until the year 305 AD. And the last persecution was under Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 AD. And Constantine was the one who changed the imperial policy towards Christians, recognizing in Christianity a great potential for consolidation of the empire. After the death of his father, Constantius Florus, in the year 306, Constantine was immediately elected by his troops in Britain as the successor to his father, who was the Caesar to the Western Empire. And he charged from Britain towards east and came to Rome, where he was met with resistance by Maxentius, who was the August, that is, the emperor of the western part of the empire. At that time, the Roman Empire had two Caesars who were helpers to the two emperors. Emperors held the title of Augustus. In the year 312 AD, a civil war broke out between Constantine and Maxentius. Constantine led his whole forces to the neighborhood of Rome and encamped them opposite to the Milvian bridge. There he found the forces of Maxentius to be much stronger and much greater than he originally anticipated. According to Lactantius and Eusebius, ancient historians, on October 28, 312 AD, Constantine had a vision of a fiery cross with the words "and tuto nika," which in Greek stands for "in this be victorious." He was directed in a dream to have the heavenly sign be delineated on the shields and standards of his soldiers, and so to proceed to the battle. Constantine marked the shields with the letter X or Chi, and he also drew a perpendicular letter Rho through it, and this became the symbol of Christ. It is with this symbol that Constantine's army commenced the battle with the forces of Maxentius. And after a lengthy battle, Maxentius himself fled towards the now broken Milvian bridge, but the multitude pressing on him, he was driven headlong into the river Tiber, where he was drowned. Thus ended this destructive civil war, and Constantine was acknowledged as the emperor with great rejoicing by both the Senate and the people of Rome. Following the victory at the Milvian bridge, Constantine recognized Christ as God, and he immediately started working on giving freedom to Christianity. Thus, in February of 313 AD, he met with his eastern counterparts and contracted a lasting peace for Christianity in the so-called Edict of Milan, which was a rescript of toleration of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Through the work of Constantine the Great, the Church had received some semblance of peace from the outside. However, the real turbulence was about to start from the inside the Church. At the center of that turmoil were the questions previously mentioned about the nature of the Christian God, about the nature of the Holy Trinity. From the beginning of the 4th century, in the Church of Alexandria, a teaching that only God the Father ought to be properly called God and understood to be God appeared. However, the persecution of Diocletian put a stop to further examination of that teaching. But in the year 318 AD, Alexander, Archbishop of Alexandria, addressed these issues in a sermon titled "The Great Mystery of the Trinity in Unity." The purpose of his sermon was to combat Unitarian understanding of God while maintaining monotheism. However, a presbyter in Alexandria named Arius, who was a presbyter in the region of Bavcalis, which is the neighborhood of Alexandria where, according to tradition, Saint Mark martyred, challenged Alexander's theology, arguing that it did not uphold sufficiently distinctions within the Godhead. Ironically, Arius accused Alexander of professing monarchianism. Monarchianism was an ancient heresy that challenged the divinity of the Logos, that is, the second person of the Holy Trinity, God the Son. Specifically, Arius accused Alexander of preaching Sabellianism, which is a form of monarchianism that did not distinguish between the persons of God the Father and the person of God the Logos, God the Son. Sabellianism got its name from a 3rd century Roman teacher, Sabelius. He taught that the Father and the Son are one and the same, personal being. The only difference between the two is that of nomenclature, meaning only the names were different, but those names were attributed to one and the same person. Yet it was Arius who in fact challenged the divinity of the Logos. And the question that occupied the 4th century Church of Alexandria was, how was the Father, Son, Holy Spirit God to be reconciled with the Scriptures? And Arius' answer was that the Son of God was not truly God, that he was only ktisma, creature of God the Father, and that only God the Father can be properly called God. Christ is called divine not because of his divine nature, but because of his goodness. Christ was a creature, not the creator, and thus was different from the Father in substance. Arius argued that only Father is uncreated. Christ, the Son, for Arius was the most perfect of all creatures, but he was not co-equal, co-eternal, and consubstantial, that is, of the same substance, divine substance, with God the Father. Arius' teaching rapidly became very popular because it was simple and easy to understand, and because it preserved monotheism while asserting that Christ was indeed a great being. Of course, Bishop Alexander and all Orthodox clergy attacked Arius' teaching as heretical. Emperor Constantine, displeased at the new division among the Christians, unsuccessfully tried to settle the dispute by a letter. And then, finally, he summoned all bishops throughout the world to come to Nicaea in the spring of 325 AD to settle the dispute in a conciliar manner. Nicaea is a city in Bithynia, in Asia Minor. In the 4th century, it was already an important center in the Eastern Roman Empire. The peace in the church was so important to Constantine that he offered that all bishops throughout the world come to Nicaea at the expense of the imperial coffers. Each bishop was allowed to bring 5 members in his entourage, priests and deacons. The traditional number of participants, bishops, is 318, which is symbolically the number of the servants of Abraham. It is anticipated that in the end there were between 15 and 1800 people present at the council. The main item on the agenda of the council was the issue of Arius and his teaching. The council also addressed the date of the celebration of Easter and made it uniform for the entire Church of God. And it also addressed a schism in the Church of Alexandria. Emperor Constantine himself presided over the council, although we are told that he did not take active part in the decision-making. He did not vote. And although he was present as an emperor at the council, he sat at a regular chair, not an imperial throne. It was the bishops who formulated a universal profession of faith, the so-called the Nicene Creed, and condemned Arius expressly. The Creed proclaims that God is one in 3 persons, in the person of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It also says that the Son was incarnate and became Christ, and that God, the Son, is consubstantial, that is, of one and the same substance or essence with God the Father. The council condemned as heretical the teaching of Arius that Christ was the greatest and highest creature and that he was not God. It was this statement of the Council of Nicaea, which was agreed upon by its members, that was revisited some 56 years later at the Second Ecumenical Council, which met in the year 381 in Constantinople. The council met to address the heresy of a certain Macedonius who challenged the divinity of the Holy Spirit. The heresy of Macedonius was condemned. The divinity of the Holy Spirit was upheld by that council, and a relevant definition was attached to the Creed of Nicaea. From that point onwards, the creed is known as the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed and is read in all Orthodox churches at every divine liturgy as the symbol of Christian faith. It is through Constantine's endeavors, as we have seen, that the First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea, met in the year 325, after a very short period of peace for the Church. And it is through the work of this Ecumenical Council that the purity of faith was defined and left for posterity in the statement of the faith, known as the Creed of Nicaea. And that statement of the faith became standard of orthodoxy until this